Who do you think is really printing the dollars you're holding? Do you believe that the United States government, a symbol of democracy and the power of the people, is in control of the nation's currency? If so, you've been deceived in an extremely sophisticated way. Most Americans and the world think that the Federal Reserve, Fed, is part of the government, operating for the public good. But the truth is much more complex and frightening. Imagine this: a group of people who are not elected, not accountable to Congress, and not bound by any votes, hold the power to print the money of an entire country. They can create money out of thin air, decide interest rates, and even accidentally spark recessions or inflate asset bubbles, all with a few lines of command in a closed room. Now, the real question that needs to be asked is, are we living in a democratic economic system? Or are we just playing a role in a huge illusion, where financial freedom is just an illusion, and all our hard work is silently serving a powerful group we don't even know? In this video, we will unveil the secret history behind the controversial founding of the Fed, decode its undemocratic operational mechanisms, and explain why true financial freedom cannot be achieved if you don't understand the truth about this organization. Prepare yourself. What you're about to hear may make you never look at money and the world the same way again. To understand what the Fed is, we can't just look at its current economic function. We need to go back in time to the early 20th century when the U.S. financial system was a broken machine, constantly malfunctioning due to bank panics, especially the 1907 financial crisis. That's when the elite financiers realized they needed a more powerful tool, not just to stabilize the market, but to control it from the shadows. In 1910, a group of people, not elected officials, not representatives of the people, but representatives of the most powerful financial families of the time, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschild. Under the leadership of Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was related to the Rockefeller family, they secretly boarded a private boat to Jekyll Island, an exclusive resort off the coast of Georgia. There, they discussed for several days the establishment of a completely new central banking system. But strangely, everything was kept secret like an espionage operation. Members used fake names, avoided any records, and even requested not to address each other by name throughout the meeting. Why was a meeting, supposedly for the public good, kept so secret? 3 years later, the result of that meeting became a reality. The Federal Reserve Act was passed on the night of December 23, 1913, when most of Congress was on holiday. No public debate, no oversight from the people, just a small group of politicians and financiers quietly pushing through a decision that would shape the century to come. From that moment on, the Fed was born not as a government agency, but as a system that was part public, part private, where private commercial banks owned shares and profited from the nation's money-printing machine. Here's the key point. The Fed is not a government agency in the traditional sense. Instead, it is a network of 12 regional reserve banks, each owned by private local commercial banks. These banks not only contribute capital, but also receive fixed dividends from the Fed's annual profits, like regular payouts, regardless of whether the economy is booming or in crisis. The Fed is often described as independent from the government to avoid political influence. But have you ever wondered, why is no one talking about the fact that the Fed can be influenced by the financial elite? Ironically, the private banks have the power to appoint the people running the local Fed branches, meaning they are both the players, the rule makers, and the ones counting the money. An organization that is not elected operates without transparency, yet holds absolute power over something everyone needs: money. If power is truly the ability to decide the fate of an entire nation, then the Fed is one of the most powerful organizations on the planet. It doesn't need an army. It doesn't need elections. All it needs is a rate announcement to shake up global financial markets. The Fed has control over the entire monetary policy of the United States. It decides interest rates between banks, the amount of money pumped into the market, and how to respond to financial crises. That means if you're paying more for a home loan or if prices are rising due to inflation, it could be a decision made by the Fed. But the paradox is, no one in the public has the right to directly choose the people running this organization. The Fed chairman and governors are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, which sounds reasonable. But after they are appointed, the Fed operates like an independent kingdom within the United States. The most important decisions, like raising or lowering interest rates, printing trillions of dollars, are made behind closed doors, with no media coverage, no elected representatives, and usually only announced after the fact. You might think, surely there must be an oversight agency for the Fed. The answer is yes, but only a very small portion. Some administrative activities of the Fed are audited by the Office of the Inspector General. But the key decisions, the ones with real power, are exempt from government audit. That means the most dangerous part is beyond control. Why is an organization that controls the financial destiny of over 300 million people not being regulated like a public agency? Why can the people running it make decisions that evaporate trillions of dollars from the market without asking anyone for permission or giving any explanations? And if such an organization does not represent the people, is not transparent with the people, and is not accountable to the people, then who does it really represent? Now let's look at how the Fed's monetary mechanism operates, how it creates and controls money. We grew up with a naive belief. Money is something that must be earned through work. But at the deepest level of the financial system, money doesn't come from value, it comes from debt. And the one who triggers this process is none other than the Federal Reserve, Fed. Contrary to common belief, the Fed does not just press a button to print money and release it into the market. On paper, the Fed is not allowed to directly fund the government. So, how do they do it? The answer is a sophisticated coordination between three parties. First, the U.S. government issues bonds to borrow money. Commercial banks and major financial institutions buy those bonds through auctions. Then the Fed steps in and buys these bonds on the open market, paying with newly created money. No printing press needed, just crediting the account of the bank selling the bonds. And that's how new money is created out of thin air. Money doesn't come from production, it comes from belief in a debt. Let this really sink in. Every time the Fed buys bonds, new money is created, and in return, there is a government debt promise. Money equals debt, and the government will have to pay that money back through taxes from the people. In other words, we are paying interest on money that was conjured up by an organization we did not elect. This three-party game runs so smoothly that no one wants to stop it. The government wants to spend freely, without raising taxes, without controversy. The banks want to sell the bonds to the Fed, get the money, invest it, lend it. The Fed wants to pump money into the market to keep the financial markets stable. And so, debt is created, money is created, financial assets balloon, and the people suffer from inflation. One question arises. The Fed can only issue currency through buying bonds. So, what if no one wants to sell bonds to the Fed? The theory is correct, but in practice, that almost never happens, because the Fed has the power to set interest rates, and when they want to buy, they set the price high enough that the sellers can't refuse. Commercial banks want the Fed to buy because it gives them cash in their accounts, reduces risk from holding bonds, allows them to get capital to reinvest and profit. So, in reality, the so-called open market is sometimes just a formality for a decision already made. This creates a highly dangerous consequence. Money becomes more and more fictional, but debt becomes more and more real. Every dollar created is a debt to be paid, and to keep the system going, new debt must always be greater than old debt. It's no coincidence that the U.S. has never paid off its national debt in modern history, because if they did, this system would collapse. You're not working for money, you're working for a debt you didn't create. You try to save, invest, and spend wisely. But the money you hold doesn't reflect true value. It's the result of a system designed to print debt, collect interest, and make society dependent on a small group behind the curtain. Money is not just a medium of exchange, it's a tool of control, and the Fed is where that chain is forged. If you think the Fed only affects Americans, think again. Because what the Fed is controlling is not just the nation's monetary policy, but the lifeblood of the global financial system, the U.S. dollar. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system was established, laying the foundation for a new order. National currencies would be pegged to the USD, and the USD was pegged to gold. But in 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard, and since then, the USD is no longer backed by gold, but by trust. A trust maintained by military power, diplomacy, and most importantly, the financial power of the Fed. And even without gold behind it, the world still can't escape the US dollar. Why? More than 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are in USD. Oil, gold, natural gas, and commodities are mostly traded in USD. In fact, even when two countries with no connection to the U.S. trade, they still have to use the USD for payments. The USD has become the global reserve currency, an invisible throne on which the Fed sits. Nations owe in USD, but they can't print USD. This is the most sophisticated leverage of power. Developing nations often borrow in USD to finance infrastructure, imports, and economic development, but they can't print USD. So whenever the Fed raises interest rates or sucks money out of the market, these nations immediately face difficulties. Debt becomes more expensive, capital leaves, and local currencies lose value. Just one decision by the Fed can send an entire country into a debt crisis. Examples include the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Latin American debt crises, or more recently, Sri Lanka, all related to borrowing USD without controlling the capital flows. In 1974, the U.S. made a strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia. OPEC would only sell oil in USD. In exchange, the U.S. would provide security and military support to the kingdom. Since then, every country that wants to buy oil must first stockpile USD, creating a natural demand for the U.S. dollar, allowing the Fed to print as much money as it wants without fear of collapse. This is why the U.S. can run budget deficits for decades without paying the price like other countries. One scary trick of the Fed is pumping money into emerging markets, inflating them, and then bursting them. When the Fed lowers interest rates and pumps money into the market, cheap money flows into emerging markets. Stocks, real estate in these countries surge, creating an illusion of growth. But when the Fed raises interest rates and tightens the money supply, foreign capital runs out, markets collapse, and currencies plummet. The irony is, the Fed never makes decisions for the benefit of other countries, but its decisions affect them all. So, where does this lead? A global financial order where the U.S. has the privilege of issuing the global commodity, the USD. The Fed is the sole issuer, and the rest of the world borrows, holds, and fears the money without the right to create it. An empire that doesn't need weapons to conquer the world, just control over the money that the entire world has to use. We live in an era where everyone is talking about financial freedom, passive income, smart investing, early retirement. But there's one truth that few dare to speak outright. True financial freedom cannot be achieved if you don't understand the game you're being pulled into. Because this is not a fair playing field. The current financial system is not designed for you to become independent. It's designed for you to borrow money, you to pay interest, you to constantly work to roll over debt, while the real value of money quietly disappears. Inflation is not an accident. It's the default mechanism. Every year, your money loses value on purpose. Not because of war, pandemics, or supply shortages, but because the Fed and central banks actively create inflation. Inflation is a hidden tax on those who don't understand the situation. You save, your money loses value. You hold cash, your assets are eroded every hour. You spend carefully, you're being punished for not injecting money into the economy. Meanwhile, what about the ones who created this system? They don't get rich by saving. They don't work for wages. They use debt leverage, financial assets, their position in the system. And most importantly, they understand exactly how money works. You're fighting in a game where the rules are only taught to the elite. The education system teaches you how to spend money, not how to create it. They teach you to save, while the very system is designed to make savings useless. They teach you to work hard, but money flows to those who control assets, not effort. True financial freedom begins when you see the matrix. Not everyone can control the Fed, but anyone can start by understanding how the system works. From there, you will no longer be trapped in the cycle of debt and inflation, but start thinking like the issuer, not the consumer. Trading in assets, not in time. Accumulating value instead of hoarding a currency that loses value every day. If you don't understand the system, you are a part of it being exploited. Lack of understanding about money doesn't make you poor immediately. It just makes you work your whole life in a system designed to never let you escape. Because in a world where money is born from debt, the ones who understand the system are the only ones who have a chance at freedom. The Fed is not an ordinary bank. It does not represent the people. And the USD, the currency the whole world relies on, is no longer a symbol of value, but a symbol of power. In a world where money is born from debt, will you continue to be a manipulated consumer, or start learning how to untangle the invisible chains holding you down? The question for you is, if the Fed collapses tomorrow and the USD loses trust, what do you think will happen to the global financial system? Is this a danger or an opportunity for the world to reset the monetary order? Leave a comment below because awareness begins with a dialogue. If you think the things in this video need to be shared with more people, share it. And if you want to keep exploring the truths behind currency, power, and freedom, don't forget to subscribe to the channel The Financial Growth Path, where we decode the world no one taught you to understand.